Hello everyone, welcome to our fourth lecture series from our 2022 lecture series, Contemporary Architecture Between Terrestriality and Transcendence. This session we are with Wiliam O'Brien from Woger, one of my favorite practices, contemporary practices located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We have Wiliam today, the founder of the firm and principal of Woger Organization for Architecture, and a tenured associate professor in the MIT Department of Architecture, as well as one of the founding members of the collective LOK. Liam pursued his graduate studies at the GSD, where he was the recipient of the Department of Architecture Faculty Design Award. Since 2019, he's also the design director of the Samara project at Airbnb. He's the recipient of the 2012 and 2013 Rome Prize Fellowship in Architecture awarded by the American Academy in Rome. He was awarded the 2011 Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers and many more. Let me translate this in Farsi. خب دوستان خیلی خوش اومدید به لکچر چهارم ما امروز با ویلیام اوبراین هستیم از دفتر ووجر. ویلیام مؤسس و بنیانگذار این دفتر، استاد معماری در دانشگاه MIT و یکی از اعضای گروه کالکتیو LOK هستش. در دانشگاه هاروارد GSD تحصیلات کرده و اونجا جایزه طراحی دانشکده معماری رو دریافت کرده. از سال 2019 مدیر یک پروژه‌ای از طرف Airbnb به اسم سامارا و همینطور دریافت کننده بورسیه معماری روم در سال 2012 و 13 و همینطور جایزه لیگ معماری برای معماران و طراحان جوان در سال 2011. William has taught previously at University of California, Berkeley, and the Ohio State University. Before joining MIT, he was assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where he taught advanced theory seminars and design studios in the graduate curriculum. At MIT, O'Brien currently holds the Cecil and Ida Green Career Development Chair and teaches design studios in graduate and undergraduate programs. قبلا ایشون در دانشگاه کالیفرنیا و دانشگاه ایالتی اوهایو تدریس کردن. قبل از پیوستن به MIT استادیار دانشگاه تگزاس در آستین بودند و اونجا سمینارهای تئوری معماری پیشرفته و استودیوی طراحی تدریس می‌کردند و الان هم در دانشگاه MIT صاحب کرسی توسعه شغلی سبز سیسیل و آیدا هستند و به استودیوهای طراحی در برنامه کارشناسی و کارشناسی ارشد در این استودیوها تدریس می‌کنند. So when I was a student at the GSD, Woger was a big inspiration for us in many different ways. To me, their work is an excellent synthesis of form and geometry on the one hand, and materiality and typology on the other. On their website, you can find perfect sets of representation from excellent photorealistic renderings to very fine-tuned 2D drawings. Although in architecture discipline, we are used to looking at these two types of representation being from two opposing camps or schools of thought, there is a common theme in almost all of their images, objects and narratives. In one of his lectures, Wiliam mentioned that their work lies in the middle ground between narrative and objects or rituals and geometry. Wiliam describes this binary between natural and abstract phenomenon with an example of wood grains in which there is always reciprocity between the forces of the materiality and geometry. So let me translate this to Farsi, please. من وقتی که در دانشگاه GSD درس می‌خوندم، دفتر ایشون همیشه خیلی الهام بخش ما بوده و کارشون یک ترکیب خیلی خوبیه از فرم و هندسه از یک طرف و مصالح و تایپولوژی. توی وبسایتشون از ترسیمات مختلفی دارن، از رندرهای رئال گرفته تا ترسیمات دو بعدی نقشه ها و اینها یک جای هم با هم مشترکن با تمام تنوعشون و اون بحث آبجکت و نراتیو. در یک جای در یکی از صحبتاش ویلیام گفت ما کارمون بین نراتیو یا روایت و آبجکت یا اشیا. همینطور یک دوگانه‌ای رو در موردش صحبت کرد ویلیام در یکی از سخنرانی‌هاش که بین دوگانه نچرال یا طبیعی و ابسترکت یا انتزاعی بود و مثالش چوب بود، خود مصالح چوب که ما در داخل خودش میتونیم هم در واقع نیروهای ماده رو ببینیم و هم هندسه رو ببینیم. As our audience might already remember, this concept is closely linked to the theme of our lecture series. We are interested in the reciprocity between form and material in architecture. We looked at the two notions of material form on the one hand and formal matter on the other. Perhaps one can detect this binary tension in Voyager projects as well. Going back to our diagram of form and materiality, which we use for our speakers' works, maybe we can locate the project called Tower of Winds in the top left corner, where we have an idealized composition of geometric forms and pieces. To the bottom left corner, when there is a large marble egg from a project called House of Horns. To the bottom right corner, we see a study model for an observation tower in Vermont, where there's an uncanny yet a familiar form and typology, perhaps. And finally, in the top right corner, we see two of the totems from a collection called Silhouettes and Iconographic Pluralism, a group of very expertly designed geometric forms. This diagram shows all four together, and this other diagram shows a more extensive selection of their works within our theoretical framework, touching different areas from haptic materiality versus optic idealism to terrestrial versus speculative realism. So as I mentioned before, locating William's work on the intersection of all these concepts makes his practice a fascinating case for us to study and learn more about. I stop here and invite you all to join me in welcoming William O'Brien.
Hey, thank you so much. Really appreciate that thoughtful introduction. Great to see how we map decently across your theoretical framework. So thank you so much for that. Just wanted to apologize for the split between my video and my audio. We're having some issues with our Wi-Fi in the office, so apologies for that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
خیلی تشکر کردن و گفتن که جالب بود براشون این دسته‌بندی و این در واقع چارچوب نظری که مطرح شد و گفتن که عذر میخوام که صداش و تصویرشون از دو تا دیوایس جدا میاد، واسه همین وقتی که صحبت میکنن ممکنه شما تصویرشون رو نبینید.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to share some of our work. What I thought I could do is present the work as Aryan touched on. We are interested in the relationship between buildings and objects. And so I thought one way to unpack that would be to share several objects and 6 buildings. Aryan, let me know what an appropriate cadence is. I'll just follow your lead on that front.
Sure, yes, whenever you feel comfortable, I can just quickly jump and translate. So
sure.
Let me do it right now. و میگن که بله منم دقیقاً از همین نقطه نظری که آریان در موردش صحبت کرد در مورد رابطه بین آبجکت ها و اشیا و ساختمون ها یا بیلدینگ میخوام وارد بشم و کارمون رو معرفی کنم و 6 تا ساختمون بهتون نشون میدم و یک سری آبجکت.
And so what I'd like to start off with is a kind of microcosm of what the entire lecture is about. And so I'll show one building, the Mask House that Aryan showed in his introduction. And I want to explain how we think about the relationship between that building and a family of objects. That'll be an introduction to a broader set of relationships between buildings and objects in the lecture proper. And then I'll conclude by just showing a couple of new objects that are helping us think about a new project that we have on the boards.
من در ابتدای ساختمون رو بهتون نشون میدم که تصویرش در مقدمه بود که دیدیم و بعد ساختمون ها و آبجکت ها رو معرفی میکنم و در نهایت با یک سری آبجکت جدید خاتمه میدم که مقدمه‌ای برای پروژه جدید خواهم.
So I'll begin with this project because it seems to kind of encapsulate a lot of the different values that we at Woodger have and does kind of paint the picture around a nice case study of the relationship between buildings and objects. This is a project for a client whose younger brother perished in the lake that the house would overlook. And so there was a real interest in trying to establish a relationship, a real powerful relationship between the space and the lake.
این خونه در یک جای قرار داره که برادر صاحب این زمین در یک دریاچه‌ای که این خونه بهش مشرف است غرق شده و برای همین خیلی داستان قوی داره و خیلی در طرح خونه تاثیر داشته این قضیه.
And so a really important mechanism became a mask that would help us to separate what we had been thinking about as the real world and then an other world, a world that would allow for a kind of connection between our client and the environment within which his younger brother spent so much time and wherein his younger brother perished. So a lot of thinking went into this act of transition or transcendence from one world to the next through this mask.
این کاربردیه که این ماسک داره، این ماسک یا این لایه‌ای که ما روبروی خونه گذاشتیم و یه انگار یک جورایی داره این دوتا جهان رو جدا میکنه، جهان پشت این که اون دریاچه‌ای که اون برادر توش غرق شد و از بین رفته و جهان این سوی ماسک.
And so the site is on a cliff overlooking Cayuga Lake in Ithaca, New York. And the thinking is that this could be, on the one hand, a space for mourning and introspection for the client, but also could be a space, a kind of platform for the broader community to do the same. And so what you see here are two different approaches. One approach which is formal and is oriented toward the mask, and another of which is more circuitous and gives access to the deck on top.
و ما اینجا به خاطر این موقعیتی که این خونه داره روی این صخره قرار گرفته رو به دریاچه، سناریوهای مختلفی رو بررسی کردیم برای شکل گیری این خونه که یک رویکرد خیلی فرماله، یک فرم خونه که میاد اینجا قرار میگیره و رویکرد بعدی یک صفحه یا یک سکویی روی این صخره برای ایستادن و نگاه کردن.
And so just to describe the more formal approach, we're relying pretty heavily on a symmetrical relationship to the facade, but then imagining a gasket space between the mask and the space proper, within which there's this kind of transition. You can see that gasket space between the mask and the building proper, and you can also understand how it reorients because of once having a kind of horizontal orientation, soon to have another horizontal orientation inside the building, but for a moment having this vertical slot of space which reorients.
و در رویکرد اولم که رویکرد فرماله ما اومدیم یک فضایی رو در رابطه با به صورت قرینه اول در رابطه با این نما در نظر گرفتیم و یک شکاف، یک فاصله‌ای بین این دوتا که یک محلیه برای تغییر جهت که می‌بینید بر عمود ماسک.
And within the building itself, we do everything in our power to kind of evacuate the main space and have all of the necessities for this to be a dwelling kind of pulled away from a void. And that void is aimed to be oriented toward the lake where his brother perished. And then, as you can see, there's a kind of formality and a precision and a let's say a level of purity to that space around which the poche kind of eats up the kitchen, the storage, the bed niche, and the bathroom.
ما سعی کردیم کل فضا رو از همه چیزهای اضافه خالی کنیم و فقط چیزهای ضروری بمونه و این میبینید که این آشپزخونه و دستشویی و بقیه فضاها از پوشه یا از فضای ضخیم انگار بین دو تا دیوار استفاده شدن و فضای اصلی فضای بزرگ خالی هستش.
Which can be demonstrated in a drawing like this one, and a drawing like this, which is indicating the platform that the community could have access to, both benefiting from that slot of space as a kind of transition, but in a very different way than the client would benefit from that slot of space as he moves from one world to another world.
و این تصویر دیگه که اون سکو رو نشون میده بالای این که از اونجا میشه در به بیرون نگاه کرد و یک فضای متفاوتی از اون چیزی که فضای فرمالی که در پایین هست.
Another layer of thinking is about how we're using the building as an element to frame a number of different relationships to the environment. And that is perhaps best shown in a drawing like this and in the preceding visualization with the mirror on the underbelly of the building. Each of the openings are designed to bring a different view, a different kind of proportionality, a different kind of atmosphere, a different kind of environment at a different scale into the building.
و ما به این اوپنینگ ها، این گشودگی ها مثل یک سری فریم نگاه میکنیم که هر کدوم انگار محیط خودشون و منظره خودشون رو میگیرن و وارد اون فضا میکنن.
So here are just a few examples of vertically oriented, horizontally oriented openings at the scale of the body, and an opening at the scale of parts of the body. And so this is the one moment where there's an orientation that is highly specific and relates the bed to the location of where the younger brother perished.
و اینا همون پنجره های گشودگی هایی که در جهت مختلف خیلی به دقت انتخاب شده. مثلا این یکی که داره به اون جایی نگاه میکنه که اون برادر اونجا غرق شده.
And so that project spurred a broader form of research, which we called other masks, in which we used that element that we had developed for Mask House as a beginning point to explore other versions of the same set of characteristics that were interested in the first mask. For example, the unusual ability to have the bottom part of that mask be the same as the top, right? Because the mask is not touching the ground, and there is this ambition to have it be blurred with what is above and below. What are some other methods of doing that?
و اون در واقع ماسکی که رو اون خونه استفاده کردیم یک فرصت مطالعاتی شد برای تایپ های دیگه و مدل های دیگه از این ماسک که ما ببینیم چه کیفیت هایی میتونن به ما بدن. مثلا اونی که تو خونه استفاده شده پایینش محو میشه، باریک میشه اینا و یک حالت بلری یا غیر شفاف به هم میده و وسطش سالیت هست و میپوشونه دید ما رو و این رو اومدیم مطالعه کردیم در ماسک های مختلف.
And so this is the original other mask that has an attempted blurring of the top of the building with the sky and the bottom of the building with the sky as well, because the building is lifted off the ground. And you can see a kind of relationship between this mask called brush mask, where we're dealing with that same characteristic, but also dealing with this notion of shifting in plan. If you remember that gasket space, we're trying to identify something similar in each of these masks as well. And so there is an idea about an oblique or a kind of duality between two different orientations.
و اونی که دیدین ماسک اون خونه داره سعی میکنه فضای بین ساختمون و آسمون رو محو کنه، انگار مرز شفاف بین ساختمون و آسمون با اون استراتژی محو بشه. و حالا تو این مدل دیگه ما میبینیم که استفاده شده از جهات مختلف دید، با مثلا از دید کج یا اوبلیک شما اگه ببینید نگاه کنید یک دید متفاوتی میبینید و وقتی از مستقیم نگاه میکنید بهش و این تغییر میکنه دریافت شما از این ماسک وقتی حرکت میکنه.
And so we view these as, we call them proto-architectural objects that are kind of free from many of the realities of the external forces of architecture, but very much dealing with some of the problems that we're interested in. The problem of figure, the problem of orientation, asymmetry, symmetry, part-to-whole relationships, materiality. So they allow us to get into that with a kind of freedom that one doesn't have in an architectural proper project.
و این آبجکت های کیفیتی که دارن اینه که به خاطر اینکه اون بار فانکشن روشون نیست مثل بقیه جاهای ساختمون، کاملا آزادن و ما میتونیم چیزهای مختلف در واقع اون نکات مختلف معماری رو اینا امتحان کنیم و مطالعه کنیم، مثل قرینه یا عدم قرینه بودن، رنگ، مصالح، فرم و همه اینها. با آزادی بیشتری میتونیم مطالعه کنیم اینا رو.
And so hopefully that helped start to help us understand the relationship between objects and buildings. And now I'd like to kind of open it up and talk about 5 buildings and several other objects in that order. A kind of natural next project to show is this one, which is House of Horns, and I begin with this for obvious reasons as it relates to the other masks pretty explicitly.
و من حالا 5 ساختمان دیگه و یک سری آبجکت هایی رو به شما نشون میدم که به این مقدمه مرتبطه. شاید باید از این پروژه شروع کنم که یک شیء در پروژه به اسم هاوس آف هورنز یا خانه شاخ شیپوری که حالا بهتون توضیح میدم.
And so within House of Horns, there are what we call projects within the project. And we very much feel as though, you know, the lessons learned with other masks came into conversations really early within this project. And as I'll explain later, when I get back to that object, there's a lot of resonance between the proto-architectures we made previously and a way of dealing with objects in House of Horns.
و حالا من تو این پروژه هاوس آف هورنز بهتون توضیح میدم. این مثل یک پروژه میمونه داخل یک پروژه دیگه، برای اینکه خود این آبجکت یک آبجکتیه که در این کلیت این خونه قرار گرفته که اون خاصیت پروتو آرکیتکچر رو که بهتون گفتم داره، یعنی یک ویژگی که یکم آزادی داره برای طراحی فرم.
One of the interesting things about House of Horns is that it isn't a ground up project. This is how we begun our relationship with House of Horns. This is the foundation condition, which was, in our view, rather idiosyncratic. And our attempt was to imbue a new kind of order into the project. And so this is our attempt to inlay a kind of order that normalized the idiosyncratic figure that we came upon.
و حالا ما با یک فونداسیون موجود مواجه بودیم در این پروژه که باید یک نظم جدیدی و یک اوردر جدیدی بر اون حاکم می‌کردیم که حاصلش این پلانیه که می‌بینید.
And so the project is really defined by several horns, as we call them, and horns has a double meaning here. On the one hand, it does reflect the geometric characteristics, but it also speaks to horns as instruments of bringing air and light into the house in ways that call attention to the natural cycles of the day, the season, the year.
و این شاخهای شیپوری یا این هورن هایی که بهشون اشاره میکنم این 2 تا ویژگی داره. یک ویژگی فرمی که توی پروژه آوردن و یک ویژگی کارکردیه که دارن که نور و هوا رو میگیرن و وارد این خونه میکنن.
This is the reflected ceiling plan, at least one layer of it, which gives a sense for the orientation of each of these kind of inverted barrel vaults. What you're seeing is the lines that indicate the planks of wood that align these barrel vaults. So you see that there are 6 horns that kind of deal with the more public aspects of the project.
و این تصویریه که ما از در واقع پلان معکوس این خونه است که می‌بینیم که 6 تا طاق کلی استفاده شده که بیشتر این در واقع این هورن‌ها یا این فرمایی که استفاده شده قسمت‌های پابلیک عمومی خونه هستش.
For this project, we were interested to try to understand the composition of the inverted barrel vaults at an early stage in terms of its structural makeup. And so for us, this opportunity to meld compositional ideas with tectonic ones became really important. So each of these fins are kind of aiming to do two things: act compositionally and be respectful of the needs from a structural standpoint.
و تو این تصویری که می‌بینید ما در واقع داشتیم کامپوزیشن یا ترکیب بندی این طاق‌ها رو مطالعه می‌کردیم، ولی در این حال باید که روی سازه اینا هم فکر می‌کردیم و در واقع نتیجه ترکیبی بین ملاحظات سازه‌ای و همینطور ترکیب بندی.
So they're similar to Mask House. This project also is conceptualized as having two worlds, one world which is on the ground and one which is subterranean. And that is kind of reflected in the environments and atmospheres that we started to conjure for each of those two different worlds.
و این هم مثل اون پروژه ماسک هاست که دو تا فضای مختلف داشته که داخل خونه و یکی اون بالا. اینم پروژه انگار دو فضای دو قسمتی، قسمت پایین داره و یک قسمت بالا که دو تا دنیای متفاوت رو هر کدوم نمایندگی میکنه.
And so for the upper world, we were interested in this large shared space, this common space, to be conceptualized more as a kind of framed field wherein a number of different types of layouts and organizations could occur. And so we think that there is some suggestion of compartmentalization by way of the inverted barrel vaults, but we also acknowledge that this is a single open shared space.
و این فضا که در طبقه بالا در این دنیای بالا هست بیشتر فضاهای عمومی مشترک باز. ما سعی کردیم با شکل این طاق‌ها یک تقسیم بندی داخل این فضای کلی بکنیم، ولی در این حال یک فضای کلی یک پارچه است.
One of the aspects of this project that is really compelling to us is the opportunity to have a really close relationship to the materials that are within the space. And so this is a photograph from the quarry where we were extracting fantastical marble, and that is the dark strand that you see kind of above the lighter strand. And this process of trying to identify the right pieces was really fascinating to us. Really a lot of expertise needed to help us find the right pieces on the one hand, but also the fact that one doesn't entirely know what the makeup of the interior of each of these marble pieces is until one gets into it and starts to sculpt them.
و ما رفتیم به این معدن سنگ مرمر برای اینکه سنگ انتخاب کنیم برای این پروژه و خیلی تجربه جالبی بود. ما باید از بین اینا یک کدوم انتخاب میکردیم بدون اینکه دقیقاً بدونیم توش چه خبره و ما تا این رو نمیبریدیم و داخلش رو نمیدیم مطمئن نبودیم که چه طرحی داره این مرمر داخل. اسم این فانتاستیکال ماربل، اسم این مرمر خاص.
So one example, although there are several objects made from this fantastical marble, one which Aryan referenced in his introduction is this egg, this column that had to be brought in almost like like a ship in a bottle. And one of the things that we found really compelling about the process of sculpting this is the way that it revealed kind of coincidentally the interesting relationship between the grain of the marble and the figure of the object. So what you can see sort of hidden in this view is the belly of the marble has a kind of resonant relationship with the grain of the marble, which was something that we had aimed for, but weren't quite sure if we could pull off.
Interesting. یکی از نکاتی که در مورد این جالب بود، این قطعه تخم مرغ شکل به شکل یک ستون اومده و در این فضا، در این طبقه نشسته و قرار گرفته، و یکی از نکاتی که مورد توجه ما بود رابطه بود که بین اون فرم و شیپ کلی این آبجکت و اون گرینش یا اون بافتی که این سنگ داره برقرار بود، و اینکه یک جایی در اون جایی که در واقع شکم این تخم مرغ هست بافت تغییر میکنه و انگار یک رابطه مستقیمی بین این و فرم کلی وجود داره.
And if you'll permit me just to take a momentary digression here, we have been thinking quite a lot about the relationship between the visualizations that we make and the way that we're aiming to document the process of construction. And we've been working with a cinematographer to help us see differently. And one of the things that we're fascinated by is the relationship between film and stills. And so we've been recording with the cinematographer many movies, all of which are physically still, but that capture other aspects of dynamism, whether that be winds or sounds or weathers or animals. That, along with the acknowledgement that there are architectures within architectures. And what I mean by that is what we've realized is that in the process of construction, there are so many opportunities to think generatively of other types of architecture when viewing the work as it is being constructed.
و میگن که ما برای داکیومنت کردن یا ثبت پروسه کانستراکشن مثل همون که خیلی دقیق رندرامون رو انجام میدیم توسط در واقع فیلمبردار و عکاس حرفه‌ای، این رو هم توسط یک فیلمبردار حرفه‌ای این پروسه رو ما داکیومنت میکنیم و این خیلی برای ما جالبه. انگار که خیلی الهام بخشه وقتی این پروسه رو میبینیم و ازش عکس میگیریم. اولا مثل یک سری مجموعه فیلمی، تصاویر ثابتی که از یک مجموعه فیلم هستن انگار، و بعد خود این پروسه خیلی الهام بخش برای معماری‌های دیگه‌ای که میشه تصور کرد در ضمنش.
So here are a few of the photographs during construction, and I wanted to just pause on this one in particular because it is indicating the light wells, which have, since this photograph, been earth has been added around them, but the objectification of these light wells we found really fascinating and kind of unexpected. Of course, we designed them as such, but we had been thinking about them so often as embedded. And so to see them as objects in and of themselves have sponsored another way of thinking about the manipulation of figures in the ground, which will turn up in subsequent projects.
و این تصویر برای ما یکی از تصویرهای خیلی جالبه که ما این تونل های نور رو اینجا به شکل آبجکت میتونیم ببینیم و البته این دقیقاً همونجوری که ما اینا رو طراحی کردیم، ولی دیدن اینها توی زمین و در پروژه به شکل یک آبجکت خیلی جالبه و الهام بخش.
Another project that we'd like to share today is called Hull House, and there is a way of thinking about circulation that was common in where I'm from, which is in New England. And in a lot of colonial homes, there is a dedicated circulation space, a circulation space that is hall and hall alone and is seen as the element or the entity or the device that will bring one to chambers. And so we were interested in this idea and taking it on in an extreme way for this house in Hudson Valley that is oriented toward the river, where there is one common attenuated space that connects a series of chambers, and the chambers have unique relationships to the openings in the facade.
و این تایپولوژی که میبینید که یک راهرو بلندی هست در یک خونه و یک سری اتاق بهش زنجیروار وصل شدن، یک تایپولوژی خیلی مرسومی در منطقه نیو انگلند، جایی که من ازش میام، و هر کدوم از این اتاقا یک ویژگی خیلی منحصر به فرد دارن و رابطه بین اینها و همینطور رابطه اینها با اون راهروی بزرگ و با اوپنینگ ها و پنجره هایی که داره روی نما خیلی برای ما، روی فاساد برای ما خیلی جالب.
And so you can see here there are several chambers that are pinned to the back of the attenuated hall space, each of which are aimed to have a different depth relative to the facade, each of which are aimed to have a kind of different relationship to the threshold, which is created by the back of the hall.
و این تو این پلان می‌بینیم که اتاقا هر کدوم عمق متفاوتی دارن با هم، هیچ کدوم مثل هم نیستن و هر کدوم ویژگی منحصر به فردی دارن و همه‌شون اومدن در یک سطح رسیدن به این راهرو و از یک وجه هم سطح شدن.
And so in this visualization, what we're trying to depict is that the primary element is the hall, and you see that in the distance, and you get a sense for, one gets a sense for the narrowness of the hall by being able to see all the way through on the right. And then each of the chambers is intended to read as discrete.
و توی این تصویر شما میبینید که یک راهرو خیلی باریک هست که وجود داره و هر کدوم از این اتاقها به شکل یک حجم مستقل و مجزا اومدن و خودشون دارن نشون.
That building is part of a larger master plan that is also includes an artist studio and a kind of backstop framing of a different kind of yard space, which is also where there's a garage.
و توی مستر پلان، توی سایت پلان کلی اینجا میبینید که همینطور یک خونه اون ته هست و یک فضای حیاتی بین اینا که وجود داره و رابطه‌ای که بین این خونه‌های مختلف تو این سایت وجود داره، اتاق‌های مختلف.
But the hope is that each of the chambers has a distinctive character, and that is informed by its relationship to the hall and the mask of the hall, but also its relationship or lack thereof to the back of the site.
و هر کدوم از این اتاقا هدف این بود که یک کاراکتر، یک شخصیت منحصر به فردی داشته باشن و از یک طرف در رابطهشون با این راهرو تعریف بشن و از طرف دیگه در رابطهشون با دیوار پشتی که روی حیاته.
So here is just a sequence that maintains the back of the hall in the same location and gives a sense for how the hall has a kind of entasis to it, and that there is a relationship between the depth of each of the chambers and the back of the hall that is dynamic.
و در این سلسله سری سکشن های مختلف میبینید که اون راهرو یا اون هال ثابته و یک جا وایستاده و اتاقهای مختلف در طول این مقطع دیده میشن که هر کدوم عمق و ارتفاع و اندازه مختلفی داره.
And as you can imagine, a kind of natural extension of that logic is to separate conceptually each of the zones along the hall and think about how it pairs with each of the chambers. And so the facade is designed as a series of moments along the length of the facade as they relate to each of the chambers, which produces a kind of seemingly sporadic and distinct and varied facade.
و این رو باز ما این اتاقا رو اینجا میتونیم به صورت جدا ببینیم و رابطه هر کدوم از اینا که با اون نمای مختص به خودشون به صورت مجزا دارن.
Shifting to another project, which is about an attenuated facade. There's a lot of relationships between this project and the previous project. Is a house for a collector, and the differences in a lot of our residential projects have to do with roof typology. One of the realizations that we've had about body of work that is around residential projects in the office is that each of them try to, when possible, take on a different roof typology as a way of thinking about and challenging us in terms of how that sponsors a different way of thinking about planimetric organization.
این یک پروژه خونه دیگه که بهتون نشون میدم، House for Collector اسمش هست، یک خونه برای کالکتر یا جمع آوری کننده یا کلکسیونر. و این توی این پروژه مثل همون یک دیوار بلندی رو داریم، یک نمای کشیده‌ای رو داریم، ولی یه فرقی که داره سقفشه و ما سعی می‌کنیم سقف‌های مختلف و تایپولوژی سقف مختلف رو امتحان کنیم برای پروژه مختلف و رابطه‌اش رو با بازنمایی پلانومتریک یا تخت ببینیم.
So understanding that there is this continuous shed roof to help us deal with the snow load in Williamstown, Massachusetts, we kind of conceived of a set of objects in a kind of racial white-red manner where we could understand what was similar to them in the sense of the shed roof, and in terms of the relationship to the exterior through these window protrusions. But we could also start to imbue these objects with a sense of hierarchy.
و این کلکسیون آبجکت هایی که ما اینجا درست کردیم در واقع یک جورایی که ارجاع دارن به پروژه های ریچل وایت رد که در واقع کست میکرد داخل خونه هایی رو و به صورت آبجکت اینا رو به نمایش میذاشت. ما هم یک چنین مجموعی درست کردیم و یک جور سلسله مراتب یا هایرارکی بین این اشیاء مختلف وجود داره.
As Ariane touched on at the beginning of the talk in the introduction, we are really interested in trying to depict narratives that are suggestive of the unique ways that people dwell. And so in this visualization, we're really interested in trying to depict the collector's life, in addition to some of the ways that is related to and informed by, and essentially has a reciprocal relationship with the architecture. So we're really interested in these visualizations kind of projecting a relationship between the way that they're lived in and the benefits of the way that the architecture is developed to anticipate that mode of dwelling.
همونطور که در مقدمه بهش اشاره شد، ما اینجا خیلی دوست داریم که تو این تصویرامون یک نراتیو یا یک روایت رو نشون بدیم از سبک زندگی اون کسی که اینجا هست. مثلا اینجا خونه اون کالکتره بود که وسایل مختلفی جمع می‌کرد و ما تو این تصویرها سعی کردیم که رابطه این رو یک جوری داریم روایت گویی می‌کنیم با این تصویرسازیه و رابطه اون با معماری ساختمان برامون جالب.
And maybe distinct from the Hall House, there is a different kind of conceptual lens through which we see the openings in this project, and that is through a series of pairs. So I think the drawing kind of speaks for itself, but we were really compelled by this notion of horizontal and vertical pairs, and of aiming to the extent possible, reduce the number of differences, while at the same time not falling into a trap of, let's say, eradicating the idiosyncratic or the oddity of a facade, which we find really compelling, but trying to find a kind of balance between the level of idiosyncrasy and the level of rationalism.
و ما سعی کردیم که تو این تصویر که می‌بینید برای نمای ساختمان و محل پنجره ها این مطالعه که انجام دادیم و برامون جالبه و ما اینا رو جفت کردیم با همین پنجره ها رو و اینا همونجور که تو تصویر مشخصه یک به یک با هم کپی همن، حالا بعضی افقی و بعضی عمودی، و یک جایی می‌خواستیم که هم یک جور رویکرد خردگرایانه یا رشنال داشته باشیم به حل کردن این نما و هم در این حال بتونیم که یک نمای منحصر به فردی طراحی کنیم.
And within the project, there is this dialogue between a pavilion that has a fire and a bath, which is a gable roof and the relationship between it and the shed roof, kind of aiming to highlight different types of interiority. On the one hand, in the shed roof, a significant kind of emphasis on warmth and atmosphere that is internal, and then in opposition to that, kind of expressing the pavilion as an environment that is totally connected to its surrounding environment.
و یک تفاوتی بین سقف شیربونی و سقف کج یک طرفه یا همون شد روف و گیبل روف که بهش اشاره کردن هست که این دو تا موقعیت مختلف رو برای ما درست میکنه و تو این حالت شد روف ساختمون میتونه خیلی رابطه بهتری با محیط اطرافش داشته باشه به دلیل اینکه از یک طرف بازتر هست. این برای ما مورد توجه بود.
Another project that allows us to move from a snowy environment to maybe its opposite is this project in a Bahamian jungle that is an active project in the office now, which is it's called House in the Jungle. It has a couple of other nicknames as well in the office, but it is essentially conceptualized as a small mixed-use building in the jungle, aiming to be as connected as possible to the stunning natural conditions of the jungle.
و ما از اون پروژه با یک محیط برفی میریم به این پروژه در محیط کاملا مخالف در وسط یک جنگل و پروژه‌ای که داره سعی میکنه با محیط اطراف خودش تا جایی که میتونه رابطه بگیره.
So this is a device, really a kind of apparatus to help the client, the family, connect to the jungle in several ways. It has two common areas and two bedrooms, and there is again a kind of play of the relationship between symmetry and asymmetry, which is kind of embodied in this sequence of conceptual models, visualizations of conceptual models.
و این خونه هم دو تا فضای دو تا اتاق خواب داره و دو تا فضای عمومی و ما سعی کردیم بازی کنیم با این چون فضاها جفت بودن با این بحث قرینگی و ناقرینگی و مطالعه‌ای که میتونیم در فرم معماری در مورد این بکنیم.
We're really interested in using this method of visualization as a way to help us test part-to-whole relationships, but as well the relationships between different trades. So in this particular model, you see us speculating about concrete, some, thinking about wood and bronze, and how do all of these different materials play a role? How are they integrated? How can their geometry be unique to the fabrication methodology? So all of those kinds of layers of thinking are embedded in this way of modeling.
و این متد در واقع تصویر مدل ساختن یا ماکت ساختن برای ما خیلی کمک میکنه برای اینکه بتونیم مطالعه کنیم در مورد رابطه جزء به کل، همینطور در رابطه مصالح مختلف. ما مثلا سنگ داریم یا بتون و چوب در کنارش هست، یک پله برنزی هستشون و این خیلی ابزار مفیدیه برای مطالعه طراحی دفتر ما.
And so what you're seeing here is that there's a community collective space below, one on top, the bedrooms in the middle, and then a kind of skewer, two skewers really, one which is the chimney and one which is the stair that pierce through that second level. And then looking to understand the material properties of travertine versus concrete and how we can sculpt them and make formwork for them differently.
و ما تو این خونه یک فضای در سطح همکف رو می‌بینیم که فضای عمومیه، جای جمع شدن کامیونیتیه، وسط اتاق خواباست و با سقف روی سقف هم فضای عمومیه. اون حجمه که رو سقف می‌بینید یکیش پله است، یکیش یک جور شومینه است و همینطور ارتباط بین اون مصالح سنگ تراورتن در بالا و بتون و قالب بندی بتون توی این پروژه واسه ما مورد توجه.
So here are some early visualizations to understand the relationship between the bed and the jungle. Another view of the interior. A third view, which is an opportunity to show how that lower space functions both as a kind of framing device, but also because of some manipulation in section, it does act as a kind of central gathering space with the fireplace on the right.
و این تصاویر داخل اتاق رو اول دیدین، رابطه اتاق با جنگل اطراف و همینطور این فضای همکف و ارتفاع این سقف اینجا و اون شومینه‌ای که اونجا قرار داره و فضای عمومی که سعی کردیم شکل بدیم در این لول.
And here we're also evaluating the project not only through the lens of photorealism and the impact of the jungle on the various spaces that we're making, but also interested in evaluating it in terms of its figurality.
و ما این رو نه فقط در ترسیمات اون به اون بحث فوتوریالیسم یا رندرهای رئال توجه میکنیم، بلکه توی این یکی ترسیمات دیگه‌مون بحث فیگور و رابطه این اشیا رو داریم با هم مطالعه میکنیم.
And then one final house before shifting over to some objects is a project that we've recently begun in Poland for an artist there. It is an interesting start to the project because although the site is very different from the mask house site, client came to us with that project in mind. And so thinking about how those ideas translate to a very different site and context has been a really compelling start.
و خونه آخری که بهتون میخوام نشون بدم قبل از اینکه وارد بخش آبجکت ها بشیم، خونه‌ای که برای هنرمند در لهستان طراحی کردیم و ایدهش از اون ماسک هاوس اول میاد که نشون بدم و این برای ما خیلی جالبه که چجوری ایده ها میان منتقل میشن از یک پروژه و سر از یک پروژه دیگه در میان.
So the site is this. It's at the base of a mountain where the client plans to do mushroom foraging, and it is there's a very small road on the southern part of the site, and the mountains begin on the northern part of the site. So the project is really all about how one approaches the dwelling and how one moves through it. It is a kind of a hinge in a similar way to the way that we're thinking about Mask House.
این خونه هم بین جاده و اون تپه ها و کوه ها قرار گرفته و پروژه راجع به اینه که انگار یک مفصلیه برای اینکه بیان از تو این عبور کنن و وارد جنگل بشن. مثل اون ماسک هاوس از یک درگاهی ما میگذریم و یک ترانزیشنی وسط در جریان هست.
And so this is reoriented. And so the kind of front of the house, which is at the bottom of the drawing, is oriented toward the mountain. And the way that the project receives the client is from the top of the drawing, which is from the south. And so the lower level is made up of 5 objects, one of which houses the stair, and the other 4 of which act as kind of structural fins.
و این نحوه جهتگیری رو نشون میده که در واقع مخاطب از سمت بالای این وارد میشه و پایین رو به کوه هست و 5 تا آبجکت انگار که داخل این قرار دارن. یکی از این آبجکت ها اون پله هست و این 4 تا دیگه اون حجمای سازه‌ای هستن که قرار گرفت.
And so the thinking is that one will come through the underside of the dwelling and be able to see through the framed view of the fins, and then turn as a kind of hinge moment into the stairwell to bring one up to a second hinge point, which is at the top left of the interior part of the plan.
و ایده اینه که اول یک نفر در طبقه همکف وارد بشه از بین این دوتا قاب و یک چرخشی داشته باشه، مثل یک لولا، چرخش لولایی داشته باشه، به چرخ وارد فضای دیگه شه و دوباره یک بار دیگه در فضای بالا بپیچه و جهتش عوض بشه.
And similar to Mask House, there's an effort to produce a pure space that has an orientation, a very deliberate orientation out of a large window, and all of the other programs kind of packed behind a tall elevation, because that is at the center of the gable roof. And so you see, similarly to Mask House, the bedroom niche, the bathroom, things like this, which are tucked away into the poche.
دقیقاً مثل ماسک هاوس، اگه یادتون باشه فضای اصلی یک فضای بزرگ خالی بود و همه پروگرام‌ها توی پوشه قرار می‌گرفتن، تو اون ضخامت بین دو تا دیوار. و اینجا ما اون فضای پایین رو می‌بینیم که یک فضای بزرگ یک دست هست و همه پروگرام‌های دیگه رفتند و قرار گرفتن داخل این ضخامت‌ها بالا و سمت چپ.
And in the upper level, there is a mezzanine space, which is a very long, attenuated, slender space that has two openings to the outside and then one opening to the main space. And then I would also add that there is a game about symmetry and asymmetry reflected in the roof and the way that we're dealing with water, which is, you'll see two different solutions to the drainage of the roof.
و اینجا ما باز یک طبقه نیم طبقه داریم که رو به طبیعت باز میشه و همینطور یک بازی رو ما داریم میکنیم دوباره با این مسئله قرینه و ناقرینه بودن در فرم و طراحی. حالا هم اوپنینگ ها رو میبینید اینجا و هم یک فضایی که برای جمع‌آوری آب تعبیه شده در بالا.
It's probably better seen here where we're expressing one of the primary scuppers in a dashed line, which is reflecting a symmetrical relationship with the side on the left, which has a different kind of drainage solution.
شاید تو این مقطع بهتر بتونید ببینید که ما در اون صفحه‌ای که استفاده کردیم برای روی سقف شیروانیمون داره تلاش میکنه یک قرینگی ناقرینگی درست کنه با سمت دیگه که محل جمع‌آوری آب هستش.
And then a sequence of axonometrics that help us understand how one enters underneath the project, pivots, and comes up. So here we're objectifying the stair and how that links into a vertical orientation on the upper level, and then how that links up to this hinge moment, which connects to the mezzanine, but also connects to the primary space and looks back toward where one came from.
و این تو این ترسیمات اکسونومتریک میبینید این نقشه که این پله داره که تبدیل به یک آبجکت شده و اون فرد رو میاره و جهتش رو عوض میکنه، در یک جایی رو به اون نیم طبقه میگردونه و در جای دیگه دوباره به سمت اون منظره یا اون فضایی که ازش قبل اومده بوده و وارد شده بوده.
And this is the connection up to the mezzanine and a connection to the primary space, and then a series which indicates the other niche spaces.
و این رابطه بین اون فضای نیم طبقه هست با بقیه فضای اصلی و همینطور اون فضاهای کوچیک داخل دیوار یا فضای نیش.
Similar to the previous project where we talked a little bit about the importance of figurality and the usage of silhouettes to help us evaluate and critique the work, we're showing a similar set for this project where we're really trying to hone in on a reading of a kind of tripartite relationship through these different stratas, one of which is, of course, concrete, piers below, kind of wood, and then the roof above.
و باز ما یک توجهی داریم در این پروژه هم به فیگور و همینطور به مسئله سیلوئت یا این طرح دو بعدی که می‌بینید و خونه‌ای که در واقع از سه بخش تشکیل شده، بخش همکف که بخش بتونی هست، بالاش یک بخش چوبی و همینطور بخش سقف.
And as I mentioned, we're conceptualizing the piers as concrete on top of which there is this structure. We're thinking about this really quite simple enclosure with a few idiosyncratic locations of windows, and then the expression of the orientation by way of kind of clearing out the water to kind of open up and imply a very large frame.
و تو این تصاویر ما می‌بینیم که اون بخش پایه‌های بتونی، سازه ساده چوبی که روش میاد و این سقفی که داره سعی میکنه با اون قسمتی که پارتی که اد شده بهش آب رو تخلیه کنه.
And just one visualization to help us kind of start to imagine what the view back toward the house will be like coming back from an activity like mushroom foraging, hinting at the path, the kind of natural landscape, and the world of that primary space within the house.
باز تو این تصویر ما سعی کردیم که این حال و هوا رو نشون بدیم، اون طبیعتی که اونجا داره، اون فعالیت قارچینی که انجام میشه و محیطی که این خونه درش قرار گرفته در رابطه باهاش.
Great, and I'd love to just show one more project which is sort of in between a building and an object, and then end by sharing some smaller scale objects. If in the past project we were talking about an object in the round and dealing with its orientation in a kind of linear way, in this project for the Venice Biennale, we're interested in an object in the round, but want to keep track of it in terms of all of its sides rather than having a front face and a back face.
و در این پروژه‌ای که ما برای 2 سالانه ونیس طراحی کردیم، برخلاف پروژه قبلی که فقط یک جهت مشخصی روی یک سری جهت مشخص عمودی و افقی کار می‌کردیم و در 2 صفحه بودن، خواستیم توی این پروژه به این سمت بریم که یک چیزی طراحی کنیم که برای همه جهات، برای مواجه شدن از همه جهات باشه.
In this project, I would say we're really interested in different articulations of, or I would say different manifestations or articulations of the same geometric relationships. So I think this is a drawing which expresses it pretty well. There is an attempt to articulate a set of stacked polygons in steel. And meanwhile, that same set of the stacked relationship that we're expressing in steel is also being expressed in this ring, this curtain ring. And we were really fascinated by the kind of deviation occasionally and the kind of synonymous relationship that the ring and the steel could have.
و یک چیزی که برای من خیلی جالبه، رابطه 2 تا چیزه. یکی این چند ضلعی که با توجه به استفاده از قطعات فولادی ساخته شده، و یکی اون فرم غیر متعین یا نامشخص پرده که وقتی باد میزنه فرم طبیعی به خودش میگیره و در واقع روی هم افتادن این 2 تا، یک فرم خیلی منظمه که با فولاد ساخته شده، پروفایل فولاد ساخته شده، و یک سری فرمی که توسط باد روی این پرده ها شکل گرفته و روش افتاده، روی اون نظم هندسی افتاده.
And in this axonometric, you see us attempting to simulate each of those stacked volumes in the way that the curtain would be affected by wind.
و تو این دید ما این پرده ها رو می‌بینیم که روی هم استک شدن و قرار گرفتن در حالتی که باد وزیده.
And in some cases, depending on the severity of the wind and the orientation of the sun, we would get one reading which would be highly transparent, or I should say highly translucent, and the seams indicating the edge of the crisp geometry of the curtains are far more, fluid and organic, as opposed to moments when there is stillness and there's a kind of redundancy between the role of the steel and the role of the curtain.
و این تقابل بین این دوتا برای ما خیلی جالبه. این پرده و این فولاد، از این پرده خیلی متریال سبکیه، خیلی نرمه، خیلی نازکه، حتی یکم ترانسلوسنت و شفاف، نور ازش رد میشه. رو هم قرار گرفتن این فرم ارگانیک با اون فرم افلاطونی خیلی ثابت، دقیق و منظم مورد توجه ما بوده.
And if I began by talking about the relationship between buildings and proto-architectural objects, I thought I would conclude with this notion as well, and how reciprocal the relationship is between those for our office. So these drawings are inextricably related to that project, but manifest in a different project called Morris Column, which looks at a kind of entasis or an inversion of entasis through the faceting of polygons.
در امتداد این مطالعات ما روی این ایده پروتو آرکیتکچرال آبجکت ها یا این آبجکت های معماری که فارغ از فانکشن هستن، این یک مطالعه دیگه بود که شروع شد از چند ضلعی ها و افزایش عضلات تا و همینطور کاهششون دوباره وقتی رو به بالا میره.
We're really compelled by the role that materiality can play as a way to express continuity or discontinuity, or express different modes of part-to-whole relationships simply by changing material. So the difference between a kind of thin surface or book matching, and how that promotes a reading of linearity and verticality in marble.
و ما به این مسئله متریالیتی و مسائل ساختمان هم خیلی برامون جالبه، به این دلیل که ما کمک میکنه هم رابطه جزء و کل رو تشریح کنیم، هم یک جور امتداد یا کانتینیویتی برای ما ایجاد میکنه. همینطور این مرز بین این بوک مچینگی که توی سنگ انجام میشه، توی طرح سنگ انجام میشه، و اون خط نازکی که اونجا قرار داره، خودش میشه یک بخشی از در واقع پروژه که میشه اون رو علاوه بر فرم با استفاده از مسائل هم دریافت کرد.
In opposition to a materiality like this Morris column, which because of the level of reflection promotes a reading that is far less continuous and is totally reliant, or I should say much more reliant on context as a way to define it.
در تضاد به اون ستون قبلی که دیدیم که بدون مصالح بود و تقریبا فقط اون بسترش بود که باعث میشد تعریف بشه و خونده بشه، و بدون اون مصالح در اون خوانش، اون امتداد یا اون کانتینیویتی اونطوری خونده نمیشد و اون اتفاق نمیافتاد.
And in conclusion, I would love to just share with you a couple of objects that have been occupying our minds a lot recently. I just want to show you two vessels that we've been thinking a lot about, which relate to a project that we're working on for a kind of subterranean space on the coast of Santa Cruz. We've been thinking about the role of vessels as a way to help us think about how we can deal with subterranean spaces differently than the way that we conceptualize architecture that is made through processes of addition. And so these vessels are kind of conceptual placeholders for us to open up formal possibilities and to challenge our comfort zone in terms of what could be in terms of a set of forms underground.
و این مطالعه که ما روی این بطری انجام دادیم برای ما از این جهت جالب بود که یک جورایی بررسی امکانات فضاهای زیرزمینی بود، یعنی یک جور فضای منفی، و اینکه چجوری طراحی یک فضای زیرزمینی میتونه متفاوت باشه از یک آبجکت معمارانه که روش قرار گرفته.
And so in a case like this, we're looking at the geometric possibilities as they are paired with material properties. And so in a kind of cast glass fabrication methodology, what sorts of organicism are possible that we would not ordinarily conceive of, given the way that we typically deal with processes, constructive processes of addition.
و این باز این روش ساختم متفاوته با روش‌های ساخت دیگه، مثل روش ادیتیو که شما یک چیزی رو میسازید و به هم وصل میکنید. این کست، این شیشه‌ای هست که کست میشه و ریخته میشه و یک حجم یک پارچه شکل میگیره و این متناسبه با ایده فرم.
And then the final set of slides here is another way of conceptualizing a vessel that looks at seaming in stainless steel as a way for us to think about part-to-whole relationships. And one can imagine this being underground and each of these openings being connected to the sky or to a view in some way.
و این اشیایی که اینجا میبینید، اون درزی که وجود داره باز داره رابطه جزء به کل رو تبیین میکنه و شما ممکنه اینا رو تصور کنید به این شکل که داخل زمین قرار گرفتن و یک سری اوپنینگی هست که رو به آسمونه یا رو به دریا یا رو به جهات مختلف.
This is my last slide. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share our work with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Very, very interesting lecture to watch and very relevant to our theme, I think, especially when we speak about this binary of organic form versus like this Platonic geometry shape, especially in the Tower of Winds, I think was called.
Mm-hmm.
Project is super inspiring, and to juxtapose these two together with form and materiality, it's just very inspiring, I think. Also the notion of proto-architectural. I think we have time now for questions. I will check the live on my phone to see what are the questions, but before others ask, I use my privilege to ask a couple of questions. So first, I think what you have been doing with figures and objects is really interesting, and it's different from project to project. You mentioned the proto-architectural notion and how these objects are trying to be autonomous, maybe. And it's very interesting that sometimes they are the parts of the building and sometimes they are just building within the building, as you mentioned. So there are additional objects in different scales that you can perceive. You don't have to be inside those objects. You can just perceive them from the outside as an autonomous object in your environment, which is really interesting. You also, in one of your lectures, you also mentioned that you're trying to design figures that they resist categorization, or some sort of unfamiliar figures, uncanny. And I think there is a slight shift in your work over the time from more complex geometric shapes to now that you use more maybe familiar typologies or forms of box or an extruded triangle or a cylinder and a circle. Is this a thing that you have been thinking about, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I really like that question. Yeah, for sure. I remain totally committed to this aspiration of having work that defies categorization. I think, just speaking personally, the work that compels me the most is work that challenges my presumption about the way the work should be completed. And by that, I mean that the relationship between, let's say, the large scale concept and the, let's say, detail-oriented concepts, that they be logically connected, but that there is room for interpretation the work that I always return to is the work that is this balance of logic and idiosyncrasy that, for me personally, work that is hyper rational on the one end of the spectrum, or purely, let's say, singly authored and entirely idiosyncratic. I'm less drawn to that kind of work and more drawn to work that is about a logic that has kind of nested logics within it, or that finds oddity within logic. So what I'm saying in a kind of roundabout way is that this quest for work that is comfortable to take time to unpack is the kind of work that I love and the kind of work that I try to have the office make. Another way to describe this, which is something that I bring up in teaching a lot, is the role of the artifact as a kind of model for the way architects should think. And by that, I mean, an artifact, if you've discovered it, has so many different layers of consideration, from material to formal, geometric, let's say ritualistic, let's say political, social, cultural. There's all of these layers of consideration in that artifact. And I feel like a really great work of architecture deals with all of those layers, but not necessarily in an entirely consistent way. I'm kind of interested in each of those layers kind of potentially unsettling another layer, if that makes sense. So a rather long-winded way of saying, like, really interested in this idea of uncategorizability. And I don't really detect a deviation from that. I think some of the projects that are more recent, by necessity, have been more like well-behaved and maybe more simpler. But I do think that there are opportunities at other scales or other points in the project to destabilize that seeming simplicity. So for sure, remain committed to that.
Very interesting. I need some time to, I hope I can memorize this and translate. But let me ask you something else, and then I translate the whole thing. So maybe, is it fair to say that maybe in the beginning, this complexity was in the design of object itself, and now maybe it's in the whole thing? For example, in the latest house project in Poland that you showed, all the pieces are very simple. It's just a box and a circle and all that. But then in a section, when you describe the symmetry game that you're playing with that piece and all that, the whole project is something to contemplate and to discover and to learn more about the composition of whole thing, rather than each individual object being very intricate or very complex.
Yeah, I mean, I think for houses in general, I mean, one of the reasons I love dwelling projects is because they are a type that does not have repetition within the project at the outset. So just to speak more clearly about that, residential projects are typically a combination of living, sleeping, working, contemplating, like there are these different rituals that define a dwelling. But unlike other projects, let's say at a institutional or commercial or at larger scales where there is more opportunity to find repetition, one of the things that fascinates me is that it's all one big one-off. And so what I think we try to do at Wojer is imbue that kind of amoeba-like way of thinking about rituals and program imbue that with a sense of order. And oftentimes that order comes through by way of, let's say, formal orders, or symmetry or asymmetry, that we care about less because of the elevational impact of that, and more because of the kind of relationship to tectonic strategies. And so, like, we're interested in formal novelty. We're interested in making spaces that are hopefully other and transcendent, to use the theme of the lecture series, but to do so in a way that is not overly heroic, but is instead embedded in a logic around tectonics. And so that's a lot of the reasons we're interested in those types of orders, like symmetry and asymmetry. But just to get back to your question, like, I think the relationship between the kind of overall ordering principles and then nested moments of idiosyncrasy are kind of consistent across all of the residential projects. I'm not sure that I've answered your question.
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks.
Okay, good.
To quickly summarize and translate it to Farsi.
Sure.
Our audience, it was a long question. من ازشون سوال کردم در مورد این آبجکت هایی که طراحی میکنن و اینکه یک جایی گفته بودن ما سعی میکنیم که آبجکت هایی داشته باشیم که راحت فهمیده نشه، راحت دسته‌بندی نشه، راحت نشه روش اسم گذاشت، بلکه یک پیچیدگی فرمی داشته باشه اینا، که نیازمند این باشه که شما وقت بذارید و اینا رو مطالعه کنید و یک نکاتی در موردش کشف کنید. من ازشون پرسیدم که آیا این در کارهای اولیه بیشتر بوده این پیچیدگی فرما و الان فرما خیلی ساده تر شده، قبول دارید اینو یا نه؟ و گفتش که جواب این بود که من هنوزم دنبال این هستم که فیگورهایی طراحی کنم که تو هیچ کاتگوری و دسته‌بندی قرار نگیرن و همچنان شاید کلیت این پروژه ها، این فیلم هایی که من طراحی میکنم یک کل خیلی ساده باشه، ولی هنوز همشون یک جزئیاتی دارن که این باعث میشه که نیازمند خوانش باشن، نه فقط در بحث طراحی کلیشون، بلکه در بحث تکتونیک، در سطح تکتونیک قضیه، در جایی که شما میخواین اینا رو سرهم کنید توی ساختمون، و این باعث میشه یک لول پیچیدگی به کار اضافه بشه که نیازمند وقت و مداوم باشه برای فهم و درکشون، و سعی میکنم هنوز به این در همه پروژه هم پایبند باشم. Okay, there is another interesting binary between these two that I can think of your references that you usually mention. One is Haydock, that the mask house reminds me of his house, but also the idea of frontation and rotation, which is super common in his works, and also the idea of the symmetry and asymmetry, which you do in your design phase. And also you've referenced liberate before, and the tectonic part and materiality and all that. And what you're doing, it's interesting in this way for me, that you're trying to basically, I understand, synthesize these two, and then try to also, you were explaining when you were talking about that marble egg, that there is a geometric piece to it and there is a material piece to it. And I think that's a very successful part of the works. I was wondering what's your, so now that you have these projects under construction in American context, what do you think of can you talk a little bit more about the influence of those situations in the construction culture in America, and how different it is to some European references that you look at, how that might influence your work? Do you think you need to resist that, or do you think you can just exploit it and use it as your advantage in some of the project, the different techniques and means in American context?
Yeah, we've been, maybe to work backward through that question, there is an ongoing conversation within the office about what it means to be like an American architect, and whether we're talking about, the differences between level of of craftsmanship between, say, the US and elsewhere, or whether we're talking about like deviation from standard methods of construction. You know, like actually just having a conversation a couple days ago about the critical, having a critical lens toward construction document sets as a representational mode that speaks to craftspeople, and how to show intent through construction document set, and what that means for each of the each of the trades. And so, for instance, what does it mean to indicate a different stud distribution? How does one annotate that? How does one convey that in a way that is acknowledging the background and the bias of the person in that trade? What are the defaults, and how does one deviate from those defaults? And what are the modes of representation that help highlight that to, you know, eliminate confusion and ways of, you know, producing errors. And you know, so there's that kind of conversation going on in the office, which is about representation and communication. And there's another conversation which is about, like, what can we do well here that we can take advantage of? And, you know, we see that probably most in House of Horns, where you know, we've been thinking about all of the finishes and all of the let's say methods of construction through that lens. And so, you know, maybe one of the most challenging aspects to that project is the incredible mill work that has to be done in order to have wood come together in a mitered condition. And so we've put a ton of emphasis in communicating with our craftspeople about how that should be done, and they've been, you know, just incredible. And so I want to be clear that, like, when we think about what's possible in the US versus elsewhere, there's not like an instinctive lowering of the bar. It's just a question of what are we focusing on, and how do we kind of put eggs in that basket in order to ensure that there is a high level of success. And it's about directing, you know, energy and resources and attention to that if that's important to the project. Because I do think you can find dedicated, invested craftspeople, you know, in many trades here. It's just a question of alignment of values. So we've been lucky in that regard. To get back to the earlier part of your question, Arjan, about Haydick versus Leverance, I think that's a really, I appreciate that reflection a lot, that observation a lot. And I would say to that, you know, the way that we think about figuration might be similar to Haydick in the sense that we're excited by figures that are, you know, headed toward a kind of anthropomorphism, but are denied like a clear reading of it as a funny character. And similarly, you know, interested in Leverance's directness in terms of tectonic approach, but, you know, happy when that directness gets complicated or more rich by another aspiration that we have, which is maybe, you know, doesn't follow that logic trail. So in either case, trying to kind of erode the would-be clarity of each of those kinds of ways of working in those precedents.
Very interesting and helpful. Thank you. Let me translate that quickly. خب دوستان، من ترجمه میکنم سوالی که پرسیدم و من در مورد یک مقایسه ای اول کردم و کارشون رو با دو تا ارجاعی که دادن، دفتر جان هیداک، کار جان هیداک، همینطور کار لیبرنس، و اینکه گفتم که آیا به نظرتون کار شما یک ترکیب این دوتا هست در سطح طراحی و ساخت، و گفتم براشون جالب بوده این ایده، ولی روش نگاهشون به این طراحی آبجکت ها هم شبیه هیداک و هم متفاوت. تو کار ایشون هم یک جور انتروپومورفیزم هست، یک جور در آبجکت ها میخوان یک جور شکل انسانگونه باشن، ولی در این حال نمیخوان که فانی باشن یا خنده‌دار باشن، نمیخوان که خیلی پلیفول باشن، بلکه هر کدوم در واقع شخصیت متفاوتی دارن با کار هیداک. در مورد ساختمون و صنعت ساختمون پرسیدم ازشون و اینکه در بستر آمریکا آیا چه تجربه داشتن، آیا این تجربه کار با سازندگان آمریکایی برخلاف ارجاعاتی که دارن و نگاهی که به معماری اروپا دارن چه تاثیر تو کارشون داشته، که گفتن ما دو تا کار خیلی مهم میکنیم. یکی این که سعی میکنیم داکیومنت کنیم کانستراکشنمون رو و کارهای کانستراکشنمون رو به دقت و اینا رو ازش به عنوان یک ابزار استفاده کنیم در دفترمون، هم برای کامیونیکیشن هم برای طراحی و فکر کردن به پروژه، و سعی میکنیم کنترل دقیقی داشته باشیم روی انتخاب سازندگانمون و کسایی که میان کارا رو برای ما میسازن و سعی کنیم که بهترین کرافتسمن‌ها رو پیدا کنیم برای اینکه به اون چیزی که در ایده هامون هست نزدیک بشن. Okay, there is another question about an urban context and city, and they're wondering if you have considered doing project in an urban context and how that would be different, the idea of objecthood in an urban context.
It's an incredibly timely question. Literally within the window of 24 or 48 hours. So we are talking about that in the office as of yesterday. We're working on a project right now for a city, without getting into specifics, it's really early, but we are, the way that we are getting into it is to think about the conceptual model and the part-to-whole relationships in the same way that we showed for the Bahamian project and for the Poland project. But thinking about those part-to-whole relationships as not autonomous, but of course they have relationships in and of themselves, but they also have really important relationships to the fabric that surrounds them. So we're approaching it in two ways. One is through a kind of, normal and responsible way of understanding what's around in terms of morphology, density, things like this, but also aiming to maintain some of the ways that we work formally so that there is a kind of clarity about the part and the whole. So just to be a little bit more specific, this project that we're thinking about right now has a very slender and tall part to it. And it also has a kind of more normative volumetric part to it. And so one of the ways in that we've been really excited about is to look at the plausibility of importing some of our other masks just as a way to brainstorm into the project and kind of test out what it means to think about typologies through models like that. So that's just maybe scratching the surface a little bit, but all that to say, like, I love the question. It's exactly where we want to move. We're really interested in expanding our body of work from residential to larger, to institutional and cultural, and public projects. And so I'm really thankful for the question. It's on our minds a lot.
Thank you. Let me translate please. گفتن که خیلی سوال در مورد شهر و کار در بستر شهری خیلی به موقع بود. این پرسیدین اتفاقا جدیداً فاصله خیلی کم یک پروژه مطرح شده در این مورد و امروز کار میکنیم و توی اون هم مثل پروژه دیگه‌مون این بحث‌های طراحی خود معماری، بحث جزء به کل برای ما خیلی مهمه، بحث اینکه این اجزا با هم چه رابطه‌ای دارن و حالا رابطه اونا با سایت چطور میتونه باشه و چه جوری میتونن تاثیر بپذیرن و همینطور داریم اون ایده مسک هامون رو امتحان میکنیم. این پروژه که داریم کار میکنیم روش یک بخش حالت بلند مرتبه‌ای داره که داریم اون مسک ها رو اون تست میکنیم و پروژه های جدید فرهنگی و عمومی بیشتری هم داریم میگیریم و خیلی دفترمون به این دنبال هست که به اون سمت بره و فقط خونه طراحی نکنه. Okay, there is one last question. Thank you so much for your patience. It's a little bit over our time, but let me ask this last question before we conclude. About typology and transformation of typology into new buildings. And do you think in most of your project the typology is the point of departure, or it's more geometry that you start with based on the site? And how do these two meet?
I would say that there's this question of this question that we pose a lot, which is relative to what? So, if we're talking about defamiliarization, which is a term that we use a lot, or departing from some mutually understood state, relative to what? And so I think geometry is considered in that moment, but I would say that's a little bit broad. I think it's more useful for us to be thinking about roof typology in the context of some of the residential projects we're working on, or typologies, object typologies, or I'm thinking about using vessels as a way of thinking about the subterranean project we're working on currently, or the typologies of masks. These things that kind of are specific about, like they are referential toward things that we know, but they're not overly specific about their geometry. So I realize I'm being a bit vague there. I'm kind of grouping roof typologies, building typologies, object typologies, but I do think there's a kind of like like a bubble around all of those for us, in that they give us enough footing, but they don't, and they offer a way for us to convey that to an outside audience, and then depart from it in ways that seem necessary, because we're interested in those kinds of departures, or because there's a unique attribute to the site, or there's a unique aspect to the client's rituals. There are a lot of ways to start to destabilize a norm, but I think for us, those norms typically begin with things that everybody knows, not just architects, like a vessel, like a mask, like a shed roof. These things are quite accessible, but then how can we undermine them? How can we hopefully enrich them?
Wonderful. Thanks. Let me translate, please. در مورد تایپولوژی صحبتشون این بود که به تایپولوژی ها به این شکل فکر میکنن که بخش‌های مختلف ساختمون، مثلا شما تایپولوژی مختلف سقف دارین، مختلف ساختمون دارین، تایپولوژی محلی هست که اینا رو بررسی میکنن و جمع‌آوری میکنن و روشون کار میکنن توی پروژه ها و اینها رو فراتر میبرن، یک جوره آشنازدایی میکنن با استفاده از روندهای مختلف که هر کدوم با توجه به شرایط مختص به اون پروژه استفاده بشه و این نگاهیه که توضیح دادن که در پروژه مختلف استفاده میشه و ازش برای طراحی استفاده میکنن در کنار هندسه و در واقع دستکاری هندسی که توی هر کدوم از این تایپولوژی انجام میشه برای اینکه تبدیل به یک پروژه جدید بشه در شرایط جدید. خب خیلی ممنونم دوستان از همگی و لایو ما اینجا به پایان میرسه. از حضور همتون ممنونم و تا سخنرانی بعدی از این سلسله سخنرانی‌ها خداحافظی میکنم با همگی. خداحافظ همگی. Okay, thank you very much, William. It was a wonderful, very, very good opportunity for us to have you and have this lecture. We really appreciate it, and we really thank your time. Best of luck for Roger and you and all your colleagues in your endeavor.
Thank you, Aryan. Yeah, I really appreciate the chance to share the work, and I also appreciate your patience in helping to translate. Thank you so much, and thanks to the CAAI for the opportunity. A real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you. Maybe we can stay in Zoom for a little bit, and the live is gonna be off. Okay. Okay, thank you so much again. I saw so many people on live and so many of my friends and questions. So I think
that's great.
Yeah, this is very good opportunity for them to hear from you firsthand. This institute is a private institute in Iran. It's not a official like national university. It's like something like the CAAI or some sort of more private, but it's much more progressive, and there are so many very good active architects in Iran that are teaching here in this university, and it's a nice basically place for everyone to go take their courses. There are some public programs like this, and then some private classes and programs that different people collaborate with, mostly from Iran, but also sometimes we have guest lecturers and guest instructors there. Yeah, thank you very much. And
great, thank you so much. Yeah, keep in touch, and I want to know how the project comes out, and I'll look, keep my eyes peeled to see if there are any previews at some point.
Absolutely, I would love that. Also, I'd love to follow your work coming either from your practice or somewhere. And also, thanks for your patience for the translation. I know it was a longer lecture than usual, but
my pleasure.
Thanks for taking time over the weekend.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much, Aryan.
Okay.
Hopefully see you soon.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.